Hello, my wonderful students. Welcome to class. Hey, today we're going to start with chapter 19. Now, this chapter, the beginning of this chapter, really marks a turning point in the class. So up until this point, we've been talking about exclusively microeconomic concepts. All right, we've been talking about individuals, supply and demand. We've been talking about firms, monopoly, perfect competition, monopolistic competition. These are all microeconomic topics. Today, we're starting chapter 19 and subsequent chapters for the rest of the semester. We're going to be talking about exclusively macroeconomic concepts, so the macro economy as a whole. And wow, what a fantastic time it is to start thinking about the macro economy. There's all kinds of weird things going on in the macro economy right now. And so in chapter 19 and in the subsequent chapters, we're going to talk about these topics that are the economy-wide topics. So we're going to talk about GDP, which is the way we measure growth and measure output in our economy. We're going to talk about inflation. We're going to talk about unemployment. All right, so these other variables that are not at the individual level, but at the entire macro economy level. We'll do a little bit more discussion on the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics is later on in this chapter. All right, but right now let me start getting my slides up. Here we go. Okay. So, like I said, chapter 19 is Introduction to Macroeconomics and the GDP. So let's get started. Okay, so one of the misconceptions that the book states is that there's no reliable way to determine how an entire economy is performing. Let me pull up a pen here. All right, so there's really no reliable way to determine how well an entire economy is performing. Economies, it's true, often do disagree about the state of our economy. However, there is an objective and reliable measure of macroeconomic performance. And that's the primary focus of this chapter. It's the thing that, hey, we hear this all the time, right? GDP, gross domestic product. We're gonna learn about what that is, how they measure, and whether it's a good measurement or not. Okay, so the big questions we'll be studying in this chapter is how is macro different than micro? And of course, this big question about GDP. What really does GDP tell us about the economy? And how is GDP computed? All right, that's really important. It's important to know how it's computed. We'll also ask what are some shortcomings, or when does GDP not work so great? All right, we throw it around as kind of like the be-all, end-all, but is it really that great? Okay, we'll talk about it a little bit further. But first, difference between micro and macroeconomics. As you can probably surmise, macroeconomics is more economy-wide issues. So you see people lining up in maybe some sort of an unemployment line or something like that. We have unemployment that hits everybody in the entire economy as it's hitting right now. So this is very, very appropriate. Or we have individual level decisions. And so this is just kind of maybe the unemployment for one individual person and how that affects it. We've kind of already studied about our micro level. Now we're moving on to the macro level. At the macro level, we have aggregate level, which means at the big level, everything put together. To aggregate something means to put it together. And micro, we use household or firms. It's the individual level. Okay, and so what kind of things do we look at? At the aggregate level, we talk about inflation, unemployment, how to grow our economy. At the individual level, we talk about, you know, an individual market for a good hamburgers, for example. We talk about choices that people make, and then we also talk about how to set price and quantity at the firm level, because firms, just one firm, that's individual also. So when we're talking about just one firm or one person, that is microeconomics. All right, GDP. So GDP, gross domestic products. Okay, this is very, very important. And hopefully you probably have seen this before, and I'm just going to make this a little bit more clear to you. So what do I mean by gross? Not like, ew, gross. I mean gross as in the total amount of everything produced within a specific economy. Look at this, gross, everything. Product, how much stuff, domestic, produced here. That's literally all it means. It's a measure of the stuff that we make, the total amount of stuff that we make here in our country. If we were in a different country, the GDP would be of that different country. All right, we use it to analyze economic growth. Why? Because we say, hey, if I made more stuff this year than last year, my economy must have grown. It's pretty simple. The ability of an economy to support income, to support people is completely determined on how much stuff you can make. The amount of income that I get or that you get, that any worker gets, is directly proportional to the amount of stuff that they can make. So the amount of stuff, product in the economy is extremely important. All right, we can compare regions or nations. We can compare the GDP of California to the GDP of Arizona, for example. They're very different numbers, obviously. You can compare the GDP of the United States to the GDP of China. All right, and so really it is a shortcut or a proxy to answer the question, how well is the country doing? Okay, I want to point out that some quality of life measures are not easily captured quantitatively. Okay, so just because a country has a high GDP, it probably means that the country is doing well and it's nice to live there. They have a high standard of living, but it's not guaranteed. Okay. Furthermore, it doesn't mean that if your GDP goes up that you're having a better life. Usually the case, but it's not guaranteed. Okay. All right. Let's continue defining GDP. So we have the G, the D, and the P. That's where the GDP comes from. And the formal definition is the following. It's the market value of all final goods and services produced in a nation in a specific period of time. So remember that, okay? It's the market value of all final goods and services produced in a nation in a specific period of time. And that's going to do you well for the rest of your life if you remember that that's what GDP is ultimately talking about, okay? It's the sum of output from all economic activity. So if we add up everything that we make in the country, that's equal to GDP. And you know what else? This is kind of interesting. Maybe you never thought about this. The total amount of dollars spent on stuff that people buy. So here's your output. So if we measure the total amount of dollars that people spend to buy stuff, it's also equal to the total amount of dollars that everybody makes in the economy if you add up everybody's paycheck. It's actually the same number. How can that be? Well, on average, over the economy as a whole, every time somebody buys something, they pay with it, that becomes income for somebody else. Do you understand? So on the aggregate or economy-wide level, every dollar spent on expenditure for a product is exactly equal to income for somebody else. So for the economy, this is kind of interesting. If you add up the prices of all the stuff that we made in a year, it's actually equal to if we add up everybody's paycheck for the same year. And those are both GDP. So it's actually an incredibly useful number for those reasons. Now let's talk about some other reasons why it is useful. Well, first of all, it helps us estimate living standards across time and nations. We talked about this briefly earlier. GDP is kind of like our best shortcut or best guess or best proxy at standard of living. Okay, all else equal, it's usually true if one country has a higher GDP, they have a higher standard of living. What we really care about, to be totally honest with you, is not GDP or the number or the dollars or the stuff. We care about how nice it is to live in that place. That's what we're talking about, living standards. It just happens to be true that usually most of the time the places with more stuff that you can buy and consume makes your life a little bit more comfortable and the life is better. Oh, overall, not always true, but overall. Okay, and so since we can use it to estimate living standards, we can also use it to measure economic growth. If we are producing more than we used to over a specific period of time, well, then that our economy has grown. So when we talk about growth in our economy, get this in your mind, it means, did we make more stuff? Can we make more stuff? And so if we talk about, hey, our economy is an expansion or a recession, okay, you know what a recession is. An expansion is the opposite of a recession. This is in the short run. Like right now, due to the macroeconomic conditions, we're in a recession. What does that mean? It means that we're not making as much stuff as we used to. That's what it means when we're going into a recession. You know, due to coronavirus, everything is shut down, and so nobody's going to work. Not as much stuff is getting made. Think about it. That means our GDP is going to be really, really small. Okay. So there's GDP, but let's clarify something a little quickly. So we want to use GDP because it tells us an important information about living standards, okay? Except we can't use the total GDP of a country. Why? Well, obviously, if you have a country like the United States with 300 million people in it, okay, versus a country like, I don't know, Australia with only I think it has maybe, say, 50 million people. And it's obvious that the GDP of the United States is going to be higher than Australia because there's more people making more stuff here than in Australia. But does that mean the standard of living is necessarily better in the United States more than Australia? No, not at all. And it's actually not. It's very equal, or maybe some people say that Australia is actually even a little bit better to live in the United States. But the GDP of the United States is way higher. Why? Because there's more people. So the total GDP does not adjust for population size of the country. So what do we have to do? What do you think? That's right. We have to divide the GDP per person. And we call that per capita GDP. It's very simple. The per capita GDP, you take the total GDP that is made, that's the total amount of goods and services made in the country in the year, and you divide it by the population. Okay, so here's an example. Oh, by the way, it gives you the average living standards in the nation. So another important thing to note is that just because whatever the GDP per person is, doesn't mean that everybody's making that GDP per person. You know, most people are probably not making GDP per capita. It just says on average how nice it is to live in the country. Okay, so here's an example. So China, we have 9,000 billion or 9 trillion. Germany, we have 3,000 billion or 3 trillion. If you just look at these numbers, look, China, oh my goodness, China is 3 times nicer to live in than Germany. Is that right? Wrong. What's the problem with that? There's a whole lot more people living in China. So if you divide this number into all of the people in China, you'll get about $6,000 US per person. Whereas if you divide this number into all the people in Germany, you get $46,000 per person. So you see that per person, the GDP is much, much higher down here than up in China. Does that make sense? We have to divide it per person. So when we're comparing countries, we like to compare GDP per capita. Okay, let's look at this chart here. So we have the countries with the highest, this is ranked by the world's largest economies by just GDP, plain old GDP. So the world's largest economy is the United States by GDP. So this is 2013, it's a bit higher now, but look at this is 16,000 billion or 16 trillion. So in a year, the people in the United States all added up make $16 trillion worth of stuff, product, gross domestic product, right? China makes about $9 trillion worth of stuff. Japan's at about 5, Germany's about $3.5 trillion worth of stuff. When you divide that per person though, you see the numbers get very, very different. Look, Canada actually up here is an interesting one. This number looks really, really small for Canada, doesn't it? Only 1.8 trillion. But if you look at this list, it's actually one of the highest, it's the second highest behind the United States, countries' GDP in the list because it's per person. Okay, so it's much nicer to live in Canada than it is to live in China because on average, the GDP is 6,000 here per person versus 52,000 there. Okay, does that make sense? By the way, the United States is not the highest GDP per capita. Depending upon the way you measure it, Luxembourg, Qatar, these are in the $140,000, $150,000 range per person GDP. Yeah, I know that's a lot per person. They're making $150,000 worth of stuff, which don't forget means they're receiving as income $150,000 worth of income each year as well. So this means on average, each person is receiving about $50,000 in income per person per year in the United States because they're making on average $50,000 worth of stuff. Okay, so it's a very coarse measure with it's average. It's not super accurate for everybody, but it's our best kind of guess, our best look at things. Okay, and so clearly this number changes over time. If you look at us from 1965 to 2015, you see that our average per capita GDP was around 23,000 in 1965. Now, as of 2015, we're at about 55,000, right? So it's almost doubled, okay, during that same period of time. And so that's per capita real GDP. I haven't taught you quite what real GDP means, but this means after controlling for inflation. So if you're thinking like, oh my goodness, no, we're not making, twice as much stuff here over there. It's just that prices got more expensive. This is after you control for the prices, okay? After you control for the fact that inflation is making everything more expensive also. We're still making more than twice as much stuff as we used to in 1965, okay? All right, and let's look at this for some other countries. So here's per capita GDP, all right? And this is real GDP. And this right here means in 1990 international dollars, not something super important for the class, but it means that it is using the prices from 1990, okay? And so that's why it can be real, because it's controlling for prices. The prices don't change. This is just how much everybody made of stuff in each country. So you see Somalia not doing so well, and Nicaragua has actually fallen. We have Poland, Turkey, and Mexico. These are 3 middle income countries, and they've been climbing quite a bit. India, starting about in the late 80s, has really started taking off, right? So, I mean, India is going up right now. If you extended that, it would look something like that. India has been growing gangbusters, along with China, are probably the 2 countries with the largest GDP growth rate over the past 15 years in the entire world. So they're doing quite a bit of increases in growth. All right, now I need to teach you about this thing called a business cycle. You guys might have heard about the business cycle, but the business cycle is the booms and the busts, right? This is the way our economy goes. It doesn't just grow in a nice straight line, but like you saw, it's really messy. It's like do, right? This is the way that our economy works. So we got booms, we got busts. Those are the business cycle, okay? And so we tend to call this the short run fluctuations around the long run trend, okay? And so, you know, in the United States, we've been growing about 1.9% for the past 50 years, but does that mean that every year we make 1.9% more stuff than the previous year? No, GDP does not always increase exactly 1.9%. It goes up and down. Okay, the parts of the business cycle. So we have an expansion, which we call the boom, and then we have the bust, which we call the contraction. Okay. Now it's important to note that the expansion is not the top part, that like the big part up here. It starts down at the bottom, right here. Whoops. So it starts here. That's where the expansion starts, and then you know if you have something that looks like that, then it stops there, right? A lot of people think the expansion is this top part. No, it's not. It's the climbing part. Okay. So let's look at this. So let's put fictional GDP on here. All right, here's time, right? Here's GDP, and you see how it kind of goes like this. This is the short run path, the business cycle. We have booms, we have busts, we have expansions, we have contractions. Here's a peak, here's a trough, here's a peak, okay? And so let's look at where the expansions are. The expansions are everywhere it's rising. So here, look, here's another expansion from trough to peak, and then contractions are from peaks to troughs, so going down. Right? It does not mean that the contractions are way up here and the expansions are way down here. No, it's when it's going up, it's expansion. When it's coming down, it's contraction. Okay? Now, all of that waviness means that if you look at it on average, the growth looks something like this. And we call this the long run trend of GDP. So you can see that the business cycle just refers to the fact that the actual growth path of GDP in the country goes up and down, but it kind of sort of goes towards this 1.9% growth in the United States GDP all the time, okay? So right now we're going to see a huge decrease in GDP because everybody's staying at home because of the coronavirus. They're not able to produce, but then it will come back up and, you know, it'll go over even. That's just kind of what always happens, right? It always goes ups and downs. So here's an actual graph of our long-run GDP from 1965 to 2015. Okay, so here's the real GDP, total GDP, not per person. So we're here about 4 trillion in 1965. We're here about, oh, I don't know, 17, 16 trillion in 2015. This is real. It's controlling for inflation. It's using the 2005 prices. That's how we control for inflation. We just make every stuff that was made in all this time, we just pretend like as if it had the price from 2015. Look, every time you see a blue here, big one here, you note that the GDP is falling, or at least it stops growing. You see how it falls? These are all the recessions, okay? So the blues are the recessions, and you can see it just so happens that GDP always falls during a recession, all right? If you look up here in 2020, we're gonna have something that looks like that, and there's gonna be a big old recession over here. That's just the way the world is, and then it'll kind of come back up. All right, so that is real GDP over time. You can always see that during recessions, GDP goes down. So it's helpful to look at the GDP. Take a look at the GDP numbers. All right, why does GDP count the market value? Remember, the GDP is, the definition of it is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given year. Well, we have to count the market value. We can't just give a list of everything that was made. Remember, GDP is stuff that was made, but we can't give a list of all the stuff that was made. That would be way too big. So the way we report it is how much it was worth. All that stuff that we made, how much it's worth. And that's what we call market value. We can't just provide quantities. One, that's just way too much long of a list, but two, does not provide enough information. Check this out. In 2010, the United States produced 12 billion bushels of corn, but 8 million cars. Which number is bigger? Yeah, that's right. 12 billion is bigger than 8 million. But what really actually contributed more to our GDP? What was more valuable? Yeah, that's right. The cars, okay? So if I just look at quantities, it would suggest that corn is more, quote, important to GDP relative to cars. But actually, the cars put a lot more, there was a lot more input, a lot more of our energy, of our income was devoted to car production. And so here's some numbers. These are made up. Let's say that corn is selling for $5 a bushel. That's actually pretty close to what it really actually sold for. That's $60 billion in the market value. Let's say that there were 8 million vehicles sold. That's actually a pretty close number. And this is actually pretty close to the average price of a car. It's 240 billion. So altogether, we have $300 billion to our GDP, but much, much more came from cars than corn. However, if I only looked at this part here, which is cars and corn, the number, the quantities, it looks like there's a lot more corn produced than cars. But if you look at the dollar value or how much it's worth, it looks like cars are much more important. So don't forget, even though GDP is a list of the stuff, of course, Mr. Product, that we make, product, stuff, it's reported in how much it's worth, or the market value. Okay, so GDP includes both goods and services in the GDP. What do I mean by goods? I mean stuff, tangibles, like we would like to call them, food, clothing, cars, houses. Then there's services, which are intangibles. I mean healthcare, entertainment, advice, travel, banking. There's all kinds of haircuts. There's all kinds of different services, all right? Services are taking up a bigger part of our GDP than ever before. Did you know that today's services account for over 2/3 of our total output, okay? Previously, we mostly, when we were a manufacturing economy, we made more goods than services. Okay, so that's kind of what I was just saying. The industries and economy has been changing over the last 50 years. We're mostly way more a service economy. You might have heard people say that. We're more a service economy than we used to be. And if you check this out, you can verify this as a percentage of our GDP. So this is services as a percentage of our GDP. This is 75% up here. This is 70%, 65%, 60. You can see in 1950, we were at like 42% of all of the stuff that we made was services. Now, if you look here, it's like around almost 70%, right? 2/3. So most of what we make, the stuff we make, is actually services in the United States. Okay, now don't forget that we also define GDP as the market value of all final goods and services. What do I mean by final goods? Well, I mean goods that are not intermediate goods. What is an intermediate good? So an intermediate good is a good that firms later repackage or bundle with other goods to be sold at a later stage. So here's an example. How about milk sold to a coffee shop? Okay, the milk is not a final good. It goes to the coffee shop and then the coffee shop sells a latte, right? Or how about tires that are sold to a car manufacturer, to Toyota, and the Toyota sells the car, okay? Now, this is very important. The milk was produced, it was something that was made in the United States, but it does not get counted in the GDP. Neither do these tires. And you're like, wait, why? I thought GDP was the list of everything that was made, all the stuff that was made in a country, and we made the milk. Why didn't it get counted in the GDP? And I'll tell you why. Because when the coffee, the latte, is sold later, it has the value of the milk in it, and so it actually already takes into account the value of the milk. All right, so the final goods are the only ones that get counted. Final goods are goods sold to the final users or consumers. And to get an accurate GDP estimate and avoid double counting, only final goods are included. Intermediate goods are not, right? So a computer chip is not included in GDP. Even though we made this here in the United States, this computer chip is not included in GDP. Why? Because it gets put in the cell phone, and then the price of the cell phone includes the price of the computer chip in it, and that gets added to the GDP. Do you see how if we counted the chip and the cell phone, the price of the chip, the value of the chip, the production, that product would get counted twice, okay? And so if you break it down for a cell phone particularly, you'll see that there's a lot of intermediate steps. So this is actually a pretty accurate description for a non-super expensive cell phone, right? So the outer case and keyboard costs $5. And so we'll call that the value added during the step. So step one is assemble the outer case and keyboard. And that costs about $5. That's about $5 of product that somebody's producing. And then we put in the internal hardware, like the screen and the camera and all that. That costs another $10. You're like, wow, that's not that much. Yeah, I know. It's pretty crazy what they can command for a cell phone. Install the operating system. Maybe it's iOS, or maybe it's Android OS. It's about another $15. Connecting it to the network and getting it connected up is about another $49. And then the retail sale, $120. You see where most of the money's going in a cell phone, is selling it. Okay, and so the sum total, they sell it for $199. But if we had added up the prices of all of the steps, you see, then we would have gotten $338. So this is a cumulative, right? So $5, and if I would have added up the 5 plus the 10, then I would have gotten 15. Then if I added on the 15, I would have gotten 30, 49, I would have got 79. This number is much, much too high. This is not actually what was produced. This 199 is what would be produced. So this would overvalue the phone and say that it contributed 338 to GDP if we added up all the intermediate steps. Okay, so we're not going to do that. We're only going to look at the final goods, and that's why they only look at the final goods. Okay, so this has been kind of an introduction to the GDP. We'll continue to talk more about the different measurement issues of GDP and the problems that occur if we are too dependent on GDP, and we can't be too dependent on GDP as they are only single solitary number of measurement. All right. Hope you guys have a good day.